Just give us a second. Welcome back to the title block. Oh my goodness. Title block live. I have to find my notes. Bear with me 1 second. Oh, there we are. Phew. And this is the third installment of the Title Block Live for April the 30th, 2020. I'm your host, of course, Michael Cruz. And this week we take your questions on sound design and composition, and hopefully we figure out what the difference between those two things are. Thanks so much for finding us this week. And if you could take a moment to make sure you don't miss us next week, click on the subscribe button for the Title Block there on the Title Block YouTube channel. And before I introduce our guests, I want to point everyone to thetitleblock.com, where you can find interviews with well-linked show notes, let me tell you, and often actual production shots for many of the guests we have had on the Title Block Live. I haven't interviewed many of the guests. In fact, I've only interviewed one of the guests tonight on the show, and let me introduce them to you now. First, Jean-Sébastien Côté is a Canadian composer and sound designer based in Ottawa. Since 1999, he's designed more than 15 productions of Canadian stage directors Robert Lepage. He's also had the privilege to work with some of Canada's best theatre directors and choreographers, and he's also composed and mixed the music of many documentaries, TV ads, multimedia shows, art installations, and VR experiences. J.S. Côté, welcome to the Title Block.
Of course, my mic had to be muted. Hi, how
are you? Fine, thank you. Deanna Choi is a recovering violinist with a background in behavioral neuroscience. Her latest project is designing the sound of kitchen production of Into the Woods, starring the KitchenAid stand mixer Matilda. Deanna Choi, welcome to the Title Block.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Richard Feren has been composing music and sound designs for theater, dance, and film since 1992. He's won 7 Dora Mavamore Awards and the 1999 Pauline McGibbon Award, and was the first ever sound designer to be shortlisted for the Simovich Prize in 2012. From episode number 41, Richard Feren, welcome to the Title Block.
Hello, glad to be back.
And John Gzowski is a terrific human and a sound designer based in Toronto. Welcome to the Title Block.
Thanks, and I'd like to point out that I didn't write that bio.
He also didn't send me a bio, so we'll just go for that. With a multifaceted and distinct visual style, James has worked in the visual art, dance, theater, and music communities. His lighting, video, and sound work has appeared in a number of international festivals, theatrical and dance productions, and he's designed for a wide and diverse range of companies and choreographers. He holds a BFA in video from the University of Manitoba. James, welcome to the Title Block.
Mute. Here we go. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Perfect. All right, and David Mesiha is a composer and sound designer, projection designer, and theater deviser. Splitting his time between Toronto and Vancouver, he's currently an interactive experience co-designer for the digital storytelling project at the Culture in Vancouver and a technical producer with Theater Conspiracy. David, welcome to the Title Block.
Thanks for having me.
And Deb Sinha's work in theater is part of a rich and varied sound practice that spans the genres of audio art, radiophonic art, and music. He's composed for the country's biggest and smallest stages. Deb, welcome to the Title Block.
Thanks very much.
And Nancy Tam, and I'm sorry, I have to get your bio up here because it was all very last minute. Sorry about that. Sound artist Nancy Tam works and lives on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Her work fuses sound and performance as primary mediums to creating collaboratively devised interdisciplinary performances. Nancy is a founding member of the Vancouver-based performance collective Awake of Vultures and the Toronto-based Toy Piano Composers Collective. Nancy, welcome to the Title Block.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, got through the bios, everybody. There's a lot of big words in there. Finally, I have my lovely and very talented co-host, Conor Moore. He's a lighting set and projection designer from Vancouver. He will now start the interrogation on the Title Block Live.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all the panelists for being here tonight. And thanks to everyone who's watching live on YouTube. And just a reminder that if anyone watching on YouTube has any questions, submit them in the YouTube chat and Michael will get them to us. We have a few discussion questions that sound designer from Vancouver, Michelle Cutler, helped me generate earlier today. That'll get the discussion started. So I'll go to each one of you in turn for the first question, just so people listening to the audio only podcast later have a sense of whose voice is who. And then after that first question, we'll just go free for all. So the first question that we have tonight is, how do you define the job of a sound designer? What does a sound designer do? Deanna, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks. I would say that my favorite quote that has to do with sound design is by Walter Murch, who's a Hollywood sound designer, and he says that sound is the back door to the imagination. And I kind of love that ethos about thinking about our work because it spans so many mediums and technologies and tools and even approaches to defining what sound is. So I'd like to start with that.
Great. James, I'll throw to you next. How do you define the job of a sound designer?
I don't have a Walter Murch quote, but The Conversation's my favorite movie, so that's unrelated. Sound designer, I believe, helps set a sonic soundscape and helps affect the viewer in ways that may not always be obvious. I feel sound has a different effect on people than visual mediums and works a lot more subconsciously than consciously. So we're the tricky designers. So.
Thank you. Richard Feren, how do you define the job of a sound designer? What does a sound designer do?
Well, the simple version, I guess, is that anything that involves sound in a live performance is something that we are in charge of curating or creating or somehow, making it work better. So that could be anything from how to make the performance venue sound a little better acoustically to miking people, to playing back stuff, to mixing live instruments, to, I've done a little bit of all those things for various different productions. So there's not kind of a set list of like, this is what it is. It's fairly inclusive. I'll just leave it at that. And yeah, The Conversation is a must-see film for anyone interested in sound.
Great, thanks for that. Deb, over to you next. How do you define the job of a sound designer?
Well, apart from everything that's been said already, one thing I like to tell people when they ask me what it means to work with sound in the theater is I feel like my job is to kind of expand the storytelling space and the actual space of the stage or the playing space where actors are, and as well as the emotional and psychological space of that the story operates in. So yeah, that's kind of how I see what I do.
That's great, thanks. JS, to you next. How do you define the job of a sound designer?
It's a very good question because I teach a class at l'Institut Collégial in Ottawa to multimedia students, and I'm trying to explain to them what is a sound designer. And I can't come up with a good answer because I use film and theater and art installation and sound synthesis and every person involved in that job, they call themselves sound designers, but no one in every field does the same thing. So I have a very good friend who does sounds for Arturia, the synthesizer emulation company, and he calls himself a sound designer, and I call myself a sound designer, and I do stuff in theater. And I've spoken to people in work in cinema, and they call themselves sound designers, and it doesn't relate to it. Sorry, to what I do at all. So I don't know what it is. I know what I do. That's one thing. So and it's basically exactly what Richard was saying, which is I'm responsible for all the oral stuff going on in a production. But and I don't funnily enough, I try not to be too philosophical about it, or just I'm not coming up with a concept or why I do things or stuff. I just do what is required, and it's a very emotional thing for me. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome, thank you. John, to you next. How do you define the job of a sound designer?
It's probably everything to do with sound. And that might be the trickiest part of it. Like different from film or TV where you get compartmentalized, where you'll just do sound effects and you'll just do that part. You won't mix it. In theater, you do everything. You're responsible from doing, like I've done Foley, built instruments, contracted, written charts, booked musicians, performed live. You do absolutely every element. You mix, you edit. I've tracked down loud fans in the space and made systems quieter and troubleshooted systems. So it's absolutely everything to do with sound in a way that's different from any other medium, because everywhere else there's more compartmentalization.
Wonderful, thank you. Nancy, to you next. How do you define the job of a sound designer?
I think besides just echoing everyone's like really eloquent answers of just like, it's very broad and it's kind of all encompassing. But I guess something that I've thought a lot about is like what sound means to me. And to me, it's much more haptic. It's like sound to me is like, it's touch, it's distant touch. And so often I think about movement in space and material and textures, and how they relate, and not just in an oral way, but in visual way, or in different ways, as a kind of sound practice. But yeah, in short, like I don't think there is like a very productive answer to like, what does a sound designer do? Is like you do what you need to do to make things sound good and feel good. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And to you, David, how do you define the job of a sound designer?
Yeah, I agree with basically what everybody said, especially from sort of the technical component to it. What it means from an artistic standpoint is very personal. I think that's basically what differentiates the practices from one person to another. But for me, it's about deconstructing sort of the dramaturgy of space, whether that be a narrative space or an experiential, interactive space, and then finding a way to put it back together and present it in a meaningful and helpful way.
Great. So I'll throw it open as a free-for-all to the group now with this question. Is there a positive side to the ambiguity that this job title holds?
Before anybody answers, I'm going to invite everyone to unmute themselves. It's this has been the most I don't want to say intellectual. I want to say thoughtful, maybe, conversation we've had so far on the YouTube Live, on the Title Block Live, and that's awesome. But I want to sort of open up the space for more of a communal kind of experience as well. So, unmute yourselves if you want. If you have a very noisy background, you can go ahead and keep yourselves muted, I guess. But yeah, let's start with the questions and see what you guys think.
Well, I always like how open it is, because each new project is going to require its own thing and its own approach, and sometimes you don't really know what it's going to contain until you start working on it, and you're working with other people, and so you can't often predict what it's going to require. Some things are very complex and some things are very simple, and you're just looking for the thing, for the elements that are going to help tell the story the best and support the show. And it's hard to know in advance what that might be, which I kind of like, I guess.
I often I started out playing music, and I often told people that I was really glad I was never part of a band that really hit big, because I don't think I'd be able to survive doing the same thing every day. And theater is totally like that. Every time you start a new project, you have to create a whole new universe from the ground up, which is pretty exciting. And as Richard said, you have to call on every project will demand something different from you technically and creatively. And, you have to really know who you are as a designer and what you're interested in and how you tell stories, but then also be open to the way that the story that you're working on is being told. And that may mean that you activate many, many different parts of your nerdy sound self, depending on the project. So it's great because every time I get to be a nerd in a different way.
I would say that one of the challenges presented by the variety of sound, I guess, subcategories and disciplines is that sometimes because it's so personal and because everyone has very particular strengths, even just for a producer to look at a script and know what that production needs, or to have a conversation with the director and for them to look for the right person for the job based on whether it leans towards a heavier musical, compositional, music direction slant, as opposed to perhaps more sound reinforcement, or something much more technically based, or that overlaps with the audiovisual realm. So I think going off of what Deb said about, it's really important that you know yourself what you are capable of doing as a designer, and what you lean to, what aesthetics and styles you lean towards is really important in terms of having that conversation with other members of the creative team.
Yeah, I personally think that the flexibility of it, more so than ambiguity, is usually positive, because it depends on the kind of project outside of the normal expectations of what you need to deliver. It allows you in some projects where it's more devising, or it's more immersive, or it's more, the process of creation is more collaborative, to actually be able to expand your own space of conversation and put on different hats and engage with the other art forms that are in the play world, in a way that I think when we work in film or video games, you don't ever get to do. It's very, even on low budgets, if you're doing a lot of tasks, it's still very compartmentalized, and you're almost never talking to the camera. You're not talking to the DOP about what angle they might be shooting from. You're just doing sound and music. So I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, just the amount of styles you have to be able to cop and figure out a little bit is kind of daunting sometimes, and also really exciting other times. Like, I'm going back to relearning some of the Carnatic South Indian classical stuff that I learned in university and played in for a little bit for one show, and it's like, oh, I haven't gone there for a long time. But that's like that should be a lifetime of work just to be able to do some of that stuff alone. And then you go to the next show and you have to do something a little bit Baroque, and then it's like, how much research and what do you need to be able to do that and be able to pull it off? Do you need players or sample libraries and the resources required to be able to do that in a semi-convincing way? I think also like the expectations have gone up a fair amount in theater, what you can do, because of course we can do way more than when we first started out. Like back when Richard and I started out and we were just doing stuff with cassettes or mini disc and one keyboard sampler that you could find, or the really crappy plugins you could do. So now you get like great sample libraries, and everybody has access to really great sounding tools and really good recording quality, and so it's sort of upped what you can do, and it's constantly I think one of the challenges too is just keeping up to date with the tech and gear and all the possible styles that you can get asked for.
What I particularly like about the ambiguity of this definition of sound design is that you can kind of be like a chameleon in a way and just like bend also. And I think working interdisciplinarily in like a collaborative setting, the most exciting things that happens for me is when I can like start to take processes and methodologies from other disciplines and then trying to translate them in the way that like musicians or composers or sound designers think. And that I think it's always great because it's not just like, now write a piece of music or now we need sound support. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. And how and so the ambiguity actually lends a lot of freedom, I think.
I like that.
Please.
I like that directors tend to have, in my experience, a more visual vocabulary and give you a little more freedom with sound than, say, with lighting. I find when I do lighting, directors are often sitting over my shoulder and, you know, bring that up 10% more. But with sound, they kind of have no idea and let you work a little more on your own. I can walk around a theater playing static for 10 minutes and nobody questions it. So.
Done a show like that.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that I like the ambiguity of it because I don't actually like doing one thing all the time, like composing music, which is not sound design. I'm sure you're going to address that a little bit later, but you know, since most of us are, I guess, I mean, are mixing sound design and music, and what is where it's not clear cut, obviously, and I don't like to write music all the time because, first of all, I feel like I do the same thing. I repeat myself, and also because I have a super high level of stress when I compose music. I constantly think it's pure shit. I mean, what I'm doing, there's not 1 ounce of what I do that is good. So to be constantly in that frame of mind is really tiring. So I really end up sending my stuff just because I said I would on Wednesday at 9 a.m. That's the only reason why I send my shit, because it's the most horrifying thing that has ever been recorded ever. So, but I'm contractually obligated to send it. So I do it. And then sometimes they say, no, it's pretty good. I'm like, what? So going through that all the time is so tiring that I love to work on pure recordings and putting samples in machines and stuff, and going to MapXT and putting speakers in the space. I love to do that to balance that my mental health, to make it work. No, but I love composing music, but as I say, it's tiring to me. So that the fact that I don't have to do that all the time is a great way to survive, personally.
I thought I was the only one.
One of the best thing something that I watched that made me feel so great was, you know, stuff about from film composers like Danny Elfman and Hans Zimmer saying, you know, I talked for an hour with the director about my concept, and then we could use all. And then I sit down in front of my keyboard and I said, why did I do this? Why did I say that? I have no idea. And then it feels, oh, okay, I'm allowed to be that bad too. So but I'm much worse, obviously.
Awesome. Moving on to your own individual design processes and practices, what specific skill or talent do you possess that is most valuable to your design practice?
Speed. I work really fast, and I think that's one of the most essential things in theater. The amount of times I've gotten sound requests for, you know, can you do this by after lunch?
True.
You put on your headphones and work through lunch and at least get a draft done. So being efficient and speedy without sacrificing too much quality, I think, is the best thing I got.
Yeah.
Not needing sleep.
How about being self-reliant too? That's like a really important one where you can take quite often work with artistic directors or directors who don't have a lot of time for meetings. And you get or I've had meetings interrupted and you get 1 or 2 questions in, and then you have to take that and try to build the show around limited idea of what they want and what you can do within it. So trying to figure out your own totally self-reliant one-man band, you can do absolutely everything, fill in all the stuff, this seems to be like really key to be able to keep going at it.
Yeah, I think it doesn't always work, but I think trying to be good at understanding what a director actually is wanting when he's saying something, because they can say the color orange, but what they mean is actually blue, especially when it comes to music, because not everybody has, they have enough of the language to be used, but not necessarily enough knowledge of that language to actually be accurate in what they're asking for. And so trying to understand through the process what they're actually really after, and then like Debash said, then being very efficient in trying to produce that and to allow for room for iteration and for that process of finding, especially in the beginning, I find finding the tone. Yeah.
I think in my experience, having the capacity to improvise, and it comes from, years that I've both been doing, improvising with other musicians, and also in theater improvisational skills as a performer, because I try to figure things out in the rehearsal process fairly early, and it is a kind of improvisation because you're taking in what the actors are doing. You're kind of like attentive to how the director is leading things, and then you're a contributor, so you've got to be able to kind of like change tack, on the fly, and just try things out. And that's usually how I come up with most of what some of it is planned ahead, but a lot of it is more like, meh, I wonder what it would sound like if I do this right now.
I would say for me, it's I'm a very social person, and within our discipline, yes, there's a lot of time we might be spending time alone in a studio, but I would say that most of my work gets done in rehearsal or in the space and with other people, and I just enjoy getting to know the other members of the team or the cast, or the staff, and getting to know who they are outside of rehearsal, because so much of what we do needs trust, both from the director and everyone else on stage. And how do you set them up for success, and how do you let them feel really comfortable and secure in what they have to go up and do night after night, long after we're gone? And a lot of that gets fostered, I think, going for drinks after rehearsal, or even on lunch breaks, or sometimes even on rehearsal breaks, and to read the room and develop that sense of solidarity with your team. So that's what I enjoy a lot.
I think an important skill is to, apart from all these other great answers, for me, one of my important skills I feel is the ability to remain curious. And I think that has a number of effects on my practice, like the fact that I'm still curious about telling stories with people that I work with helps me keep doing it. Instead of sitting back, I feel like I sit forward because I'm still curious about this, mostly because I have no clue what I'm doing, mostly. And also the curiosity is, I feel like it's part of a process of, if I'm curious, I can uncover the puzzles around the show that I didn't know were there, like find the questions that I didn't know were there. And if I find the questions, then I can go through the process of finding the answers to those questions. It's more like, I think that kind of sums up my content creation process is like looking for answers to questions I didn't know were there when I started. So, and that those questions can be uncovered in a lot of different ways, going out for drinks with people and talking about the process that we're going through as we put together a show. It can come from long relationships with people, there's people I work with over and over and over again, and we have the shorthand that makes our work deeper, I think, in a way. The curiosity is, approaching a script and going, oh, what is this thing? Or why is there no punctuation or stage directions? What the hell am I going to do with this? That sense of curiosity is something that I feel is really fundamental to my toolbox. And if I find myself in a situation where I'm not curious from at the beginning, it's really a signal to me to change my tack and to rethink what it is I'm doing for that project.
If I can answer that question personally, I think my greatest strength is that I have no ego regarding my work. For theater, I don't care if what I end up doing is nothing. I don't care if everything I do is cut. I really don't care, in the sense that if I want to do stuff for myself, I'll do records. I'll do other stuff. But I'm working for, honestly, the play that is in front of me. So if it doesn't require anything, I will not suggest anything. I will try to be, and it's something I have a hard time doing. When I just write music, I would love to be able to be somebody else and listen to my stuff with fresh ears. That would be the greatest gift ever. But since I'm not writing a play, I'm able to sit in the audience and just enjoy what is going on. And then I feel if that needs support, if that needs music, if that needs ambience, if that needs an effect on that particular word, I will just feel it. And what I like is that I really don't care if either the director doesn't ask for anything, or if I don't come up with anything and they're fine with it. This is not an opportunity to show the world how my great ideas. To me, it's the director or the writer or the combination of all those people and the actors and everybody that to do a great show. And if I have to take a backseat for the show to be great, I have no problem with that. It's fine. And if it needs music from beginning to end, I have no problem with that either. So I'm really happy in both situations and somewhere in the middle. But honestly, it's not a way to prove myself to work on a show. And I think that's my strength, because I'm no stress about this.
Well, one thing I would add to that is it's one of the most important things we all need to do as far as our artistic judgment goes is knowing what the show needs, whether it's, because it might only need 5 cues, it might need 205 cues. And you don't always know when you start, but that's one of the important things. And sometimes it's, I have felt like, oh God, I'm not earning my fee here because I'm doing so little. But actually, you just need to make sure that those little things are exactly right, and don't add anything more that doesn't need to be there.
And you think about the 17 others that you didn't get a big fee for loads of things. So
yeah,
it all evens out in the end. I always find the shows with like 5 cues tend to be just as much stress as the ones with 300 too, because you spend a lot of time figuring out what those 5 are, instead of like just getting swamped in building content.
Yeah.
I'm so happy when a cue gets cut, or I say we should cut that, and the director goes, "Yeah, you're right." I just love it. It's the best thing ever, because it means the show's working, and it's like that everything's there, and it doesn't need anything extra to put it there. It feels like I think it feels like the team is succeeding in some way, somehow. Like if there was music in a place and then it doesn't, we thought it needed it, and then it doesn't need it anymore. It's a strange thing, but anyway, it makes me happy to cut my cues, gotta say.
I think it's funny hearing this conversation. I'm super enjoying it. I think in my particular practice, I don't usually think in cues because I love to play. I just love to perform, and being amongst like the action and doing it. And so my particular brand of sound design, it involves a lot of like working with, and something that's really important in doing so is the keeping in mind of like the breath and how we all breathe together as we're performing. But I guess, yeah, within that, there are like little signals here and there that you can call cues that may get cut here or there. But I think for sure echoing other folks too, of like knowing what's right and how to do it really well when the time comes is it's really important. And especially like then thinking more formally too, in like, oh, how do we work with the space and having the space be a player in it, and then on top of that you build the skeleton of your speaker setup, and then how do you throw that sound around, and the play is really important, and the performing of it and breath is very important within all that.
I'm interested in.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, David. I'm just interested in as a lighting designer, I certainly play off sound. I mean, I was following the sound designer around basically throughout Q2Q weeks, but I'm interested in how, if you guys could describe how things change when you get in the space. Like what kind of, like, when you talk about the theater as another quality or character or instrument in your design, it's really something you don't know until you get into the space. What kind of work do you have to do besides just a flatten EQ or EQing the space to fit your music or your cues? What do you have to do to sort of to prepare the space to fit your show?
Maybe I'll start on that and take it a bit leading off of what was being said. Was really interesting. The way that I personally, or when I feel most satisfied in work process, and when all design elements are being treated just like other characters in the play. They're kind of complex characters because they're added after the script was written, and often the script writers, some can see the world completely in terms of how design is executed, but the majority can't. And I don't think, it's not often that I think of the design elements as just a background or something added to help flow us from one place to another. I think of them as integral parts of the story. And so with that in mind, when things are being cut, it is satisfying when it feels the same like an extraneous line is being cut from the script. But I also like to think of the entrances and exits dramaturgically just like a character. If you introduce a character in the first act and then they randomly leave while two other characters are talking and they never come back again, it would be pretty bizarre dramaturgically. And I think of all lighting on all design elements in the same language. And so it's most satisfying when I'm able to engage with other designers beforehand in the creation process with that sort of thinking in mind, and thinking on what they are planning to do and what their viewpoint is and what their elements are trying to add. And I often find that when that works, it's most satisfying because it becomes like a team play where it's almost like passing the ball back and forth to each other, which other than the communal aspect of it, which is a lot of fun, also artistically is very satisfying because you feel like suddenly you're a beehive of ideas rather than just like one person's very specific interpretation of very specific moments. Yeah.
Just to touch on the major step of getting into the venue and taking the work that extra step often requires thinking about how the show works spatially as well, and what is the environment that you're putting the audience in. So sometimes you have very little to work with. So if you might be just doing something in a little theater pass Marai backspace situation where you just got really one pair of speakers and you just want to make sure that it's like the sound is coming from the stage where you're seeing the characters. And that's really the most important thing you have to do, and you can't really get much fancier than that. But I did do an interesting show last fall Well, David helped me out a little bit with the setup called The Flick, that it was at Crow's Theater. And the play is actually set in a cinema where the audience is actually watching the people who work in the cinema. So the viewer is kind of in the place where the movie screen is. So I had to think about what that meant, because I had to still do sound that came from the performance, the stage, which was really the seating in the cinema where the characters acted. But also sometimes they'd be watching a film being screened. So I had to come up with, I had to put speakers behind everybody in the corners and a center speaker to make it sound like, a cinema surround experience, but reversed. So, sometimes there are special things you're trying to do with the space to make it less like a conventional theater. Doesn't always happen, but you always need to think about kind of what the audience experience is going to be, and are you trying to create a specific kind of environment?
Yeah, totally. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I've stuck like sound exciters underneath risers and put speakers in rooms outside of the theater. And, it's kind of fun the way that there are rules of doing really excellent sound reinforcement and making sure that the sound is totally identical in every seat and the balance is totally. But then there's also times where it's like, yeah, I'm going to take that speaker and I'm going to point it at the ceiling so that it bounces and sounds more distant, or that speaker should bounce or be out in the backyard or wherever else, that make it really kind of fun. In the same way that there's shows that demand that you do it all recorded, or there's some shows that demand you do everything live in the room and pick up an instrument or whatever you've got for sound generation and follow along.
To me, that's where the part of where my job comes alive, to play the sounds in the room. To me, before that, it's just preparation. I just get ready to play my stuff. It's like practicing piano and then you do the concert. It's just I just have loads of sounds and loads of tracks and stuff, and then putting them in different speakers. I'm a big fan of multi-speaker setups. I've used 26, 30, 39, 43. It's crazy amount of speakers, and just putting little sounds at little places, which to me is just like, that's the fun part for me. But a problem I've had oftentimes is that it's not a problem. It's a great thing, but that the shows I work on are going to go on tour. And that's quite a challenge. And sometimes even the best design gets into a room that is, you thought about it, you prepared for it, but it doesn't work the same way. And I did something with Robert and Sylvie Guillem, and it was a dance show called Yanagata, which didn't work really well. It was not a great success, but I was pretty proud of a few things in there. And in certain rooms, it sounded amazing. But the first place we played it was in Sadler's Wells in London, which is a very, very long room, huge place. But all my work was done with surrounds, and you could never get the same feeling as when we worked on it. And it's you can try as much as you want, but it will never get to the same place, and it's always frustrating. But so in my designs, I used to be very crazy and specific about putting those sounds in the space. But then you get to the reality of going to so many places with balconies, no balconies, super wide, super long, super narrow, so it changes, which makes it super interesting when you are actually touring the show, because you're actually designing in every city. But since I have to rely on operators, which I trust them, but they're not me, and sometimes they don't offer themselves the liberty to go somewhere else and go crazy with stuff, which I would encourage if I was there. But so to me, it's just like, yeah, the best part of my job. But then again, if you go too crazy, sometimes I get messages from people I respect very much in other cities, and they say, is that normal? I saw the show in London last week, and that was pretty weird. Sometimes they comment about something really was like, oh, I guess it was bizarre that night. I don't know. So, but that's part of the job. That's I like it, but depending on where you sit.
I find I spend a lot of time in empty theaters, just listening to the silence and listening to the acoustics of the space and walking around and feeling how it sounds just empty, before you get bodies in there. And again, like other people here, if a theater will let me, I'll put in as many speakers as I can, and I rarely use the mains if possible. Because I find in theater, if a sound is supposed to be coming from a record player and it's coming from the, front of house, it for me anyways, it distracts me from it. So if I can make that record player actually play the sound, I'd rather that than, have to make that connection between the speaker that's flying above your head and the record player that you can reach out and almost touch. So
I always look at the front of house pair as a support rather than the mains generally.
for pre-show
Me too.
music.
Yeah.
And I like to put stuff upstage so you're hearing some depth, and then record players, if you can do a practical speaker. It's not always possible, but there's a lot of tricks. But the front of house is more, I use it just to supplement things usually.
Yeah, but I guess it's a lot like, from a technical point of view, it's a lot like lighting. You have basically an idea at the beginning of what your budget is and what the inventory of the main space that you're going to be in is, and what's the budget for rental or supplementals, and you work with that in mind. And then when you get there, you have new discoveries and you adjust and adapt from there.
I start thinking about space the day I get my contract, because it informs everything. And I would say that rather than adjusting the venue to my design, I adjust my design to the venue. When I'm designing a musical, for instance, it's actually the opposite. The mains tend to be the focal point, because that's where the vocals of all the singers are coming from and the actors. Whereas I then have to figure out where the band mix sits, or where, if there are any kind of sound effect cues, then I can play around with them a little bit more with localization. But often those also tend to be in larger venues. And so my approach is, rather than trying to make it sound identical in every seat, because ultimately you can't because of architecture and physics, it's about how can you make the best possible sound for any particular seat, or to optimize the sound for each seat, so that people who are sitting in the balcony or along the sides aren't getting a radically underwhelming experience compared to being right in the front row of the orchestra. And then conversely, if I have a show that's in a 50-seat black box theater that's completely immersive, and the set designers created this beautiful set where the entire audience is surrounded by the set design, then it becomes much more of an installation type project where I can hide multiple speakers in various parts of the space. And it might, in that case, there might be less reinforcement, if none at all. Then I can play with, how do you transition the audience from the real world that they've been living in, and then inviting them into this make-believe space, and slowly adding ambience and subtle nuances that allow them to buy that they are actually transported somewhere else.
I feel like in my practice, because it's so site-based, a lot of the time is like site-specific or just site-responsive in some way, that there's pros and cons to everything, of course. Pros of going and being able to go, I'm just going to take my rig, and I happen to have like a multi-channel rig that I can just bring with me and install. And I think partly because of like the practice that I have or the people that I work with, I'm pretty lucky being able to kind of go, okay, for me to be able to work, like I need to set this up well in advance, maybe even like before the rehearsal period, so that like we're actually, the tools are in place for this to actually work, so that when we're in performance, it doesn't seem like completely different, or like that last week isn't super stressful that we need to now like rethink or readjust ourselves or the actors or dancers or whoever. And then there are those other little things too, like, you know, being able to perform with and tour with shows with like specific setup is like, yeah, designing in a new space every time. And that's super exciting. And sometimes it works out beautifully, and then sometimes not so much. And just have to kind of be there for it too. And yeah. And then also like just I'm sure all of us are like super into listening, and as most sound designers or composers are, and we recognize like certain architectural properties produce a certain kind of acoustic properties. So understanding how space work and how angles and material work and how sound travels, I'm sure has a lot to influence like how we place speakers or what material we like play out of them. Was it last year, Conor, that we did a show together at the Anvil Center? Yeah, last year, 2019. So it was like over, what is it, six stories or something, like in little glass, like enclosed classrooms in the hallway. There's this like huge convention center. And when it came down to like, okay, how are you going to use the speakers? I was like, I'm just going to use those like, you know, public announcement speakers that are already in the ceiling, because that's actually what the space has called me to do, right? And so partly I'm like of two minds of like, yeah, I want everything to be super specific. I want it just right, and I want to put it right there. But then also there's like such a joy in being able to go, okay, like what is the space doing, and what does it have, and does it do it really well, and how can I work with that? Yeah.
We have a good question in the chat from Simon, who says, in what ways do you find inspiration or feed off the work of your collaborators on the creative team, and more precisely, the less direct collaborators in terms of scenic and costume design rather than the other two digital designs, lighting and video?
I'm fond of saying that every show holds a secret, and part of the thing that I talked about being curious earlier is, you know, I've kind of discovered in myself that I need to find that secret for the show, and that secret is very often inside the set design, but it could also be in the way an actor delivers a line, or the way the footsteps of the cast might sound. It might be something like the way the lights are laid out, or what the lighting designer is saying about how they're approaching the musicality of how they want to cue the show. There's always a secret that has to be found. I don't. There's one show in particular I remember. We had 10 days in the theater before Tech Week, which is rare. We were kind of like a resident company, and I was really struggling. And the set was a number of scaffolds all kind of rigged together. And we went into the space first day, and I was kind of going, I don't know what I'm going to do. And they had the safety talk, and then somebody said, can I climb on the scaffold? And the director said, yeah, of course. And they climbed on the scaffold. As soon as they got on top of it, the scaffold shook, and then it shook all the rest of them because they were all joined. I was like, there it is. That's the thing. And that was the thing. It wasn't that I made the whole sound design out of scaffolding sounds, but that was the secret that put me down the path of making the sound for that show. And I very often, particularly lighting designers, I know Kim Pertel is listening, and she and I have done lots of shows together, and often things that she says or the way we work together in the space will change what I want to put into the space and how I want to tell the story. And finding that secret is it always unlocks the key to what I have to do. And because it's theater, and because we're working with people who are not musicians or composers or sound designers, they have a different vocabulary. It was alluded to earlier in the conversation, and the way they talk about storytelling is so different. I mean, we all share, whether or not we know it and whether or not we have had all the same training, we share a common language, which we don't share with those people. So often they say things that make me think, oh, and put me down a completely new path. And that's the thing that I like about theater, is the fact that when I work in theater, I make sound that I wouldn't have made if I was just working by myself or working with other musicians. I've made hours and hours of music I never would have made in my life had I not been working with the people and the collaborators that I've worked with.
It really is quite
I
random.
find the theater process really interesting and different in the way that the disciplines overlap, and the way that like hardly any directors will do full design meetings with the whole creative team together and jam out ideas. So mostly you're working off like input from your director, and maybe I'll play back stuff and find some kind of palette of sounds or something before. But then once you walk into the room and you see the maquette of the set, and you start working and interacting with that and whatever parts of the set they have in the room, and then you start interacting with the actors as they read the story in ways you didn't expect when you read it yourself, and you find different elements of the story emphasized that you want to support that I wouldn't pick up when I just read it myself. And I find that really interesting. Then when costumes come in, that adds another element of, oh yeah, it's a bit more formal, you can change these things a little bit. And then by the time you get into tech and you start really interacting with lights, and you're getting to the fine things of like, oh, I thought that was going to be a real snap into that transition, and then the next time, it's like, oh, surprise, there's something coming in very slowly that, and you want to redo what you do for the sound just to fit what goes on with that. I'm sorry, the mic got bumped there. It is a very large mic, isn't it? Yeah, so the process is really interesting in the way that it's the disciplines do jam together, but it's sort of in phases as opposed to some other art forms. Well, maybe everything's in phases that way too. Unless, if you're playing in a band, everybody does everything at the same time, but we tend to build stuff a bit at a time.
Well, you pick up clues from the most unexpected places, and sometimes it is like something that suggests itself to me, seeing the set design, or something in the costumes, or just something in the way somebody's playing something. Or I remember we did a production of Goethe's Faust at the Tarragon many years ago, and because the trains are so intrusive there, we decided to include the sound of trains as part of the design, as part of the narrative in a way, so that it was still going to be random, but at least some of the trains would be deliberate. So there's all kinds of things that can kind of lead you places, from your collaborators to the environment to just some unexpected thing.
I think for me, it kind of depends. I mean, there are some shows that you don't get as much exposure to the other team members. For me, if I can help it, I always love it. I love to be there in just about every rehearsal. Let the whole thing, the whole process sort of seep into my brain before I lock myself up and start coming up with stuff, or improvise in the space to generate ideas. I love that process. And whenever I'm welcome to do that, then that's my first take. And then actually talking with other designers before they have even put a single pencil to paper or did the maquette or anything. If the process allows for that, then I'm on it, because those very early conversations that are just imagination and are not yet limited by the realities of production and time and pressures, when you're just completely in free imagination worlds, for me are huge inspiration. Because, and then you can filter them down as you go along. But the earlier I can have those conversations, the earlier I can be in the space with other team members, the more I enjoy it.
I was going to say that I'm, of course, as other people said, it's you get inspired by everybody's work on a production. But what I like the most, well, the way Robert Lepage works is oftentimes there's nothing written when we start a show. There's no text. There's a vague idea of a subject or a theme he wants to explore. But since a set cannot be done in 24 hours, that's the only thing that is a bit committed before we start. The theme is this, he wants to explore something. Well, we're gonna build a prototype or something. There is something in the room. And at the beginning, when I started working with him, I was way too shy to say, is there a way to not put that there? And because I'd like to put a speaker there. And when I got more comfortable, I started to not say it, because I thought that's great. Those are limitations that will lead me to something else. Every show was, I mean, the set was designed first. And instead of saying, well, we're going to cancel the idea of those screens going down because they're in front of my speaker, I said, well, damn, I need to find a way to, find a solution to produce sound in that area with this big elastic thing in front of us. So I was tempted to go into production meetings and put my hand on just say, no, we can't do this and stuff. And then I realized that those limitations are really feeding your imagination as far as sound design goes. Maybe not the compositional thing, maybe not the sounds themselves, but how are you going to play with the set? And I love that, actually. After like wanting to fight them, I realized that no, it's good. And when they come with stupid ideas with costumes, I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna put a mic on this. And then that's interesting. Well, you find ways to do it. And that I found that very, very liberating in the end. When you find a solution, it's great.
Thankfully, a lot of set designers have been willing to cut away things for me. It's not always the answer, but actually, if you realize that early enough, this is something a lot of people probably don't realize. But yeah, they will like cut away a bit of something and put some light fabric there, and you can hide a speaker behind it. Can't always do it, but it's something we do. It does happen a lot, thankfully.
I've had set carpenters adjust sets so I could fit subwoofers in them because I like subwoofers. But I find the aesthetic of set or costume definitely influences me. There is a visual representation to sound, and there's a sonic representation to visual, and as humans we make those connections automatically, and if your sound doesn't complement the set or the costumes, it better be for a reason. If you're going to contrast it, great, but you better know why you're doing it. If I'm doing a period piece that takes place in the 60s and all my sound is crystal clear and sounds like it's coming off a CD, it's not going to have the same feeling as if I put, the little isotope vinyl plug-in on it or something. And I've asked a number of costume designers if I could put Bluetooth speakers into their costumes, but no one has bit yet. But one day.
In your own personal practice, do any of you make a distinction between what is sound design versus what is composition? And then more specifically, when dealing with producers, do you make any distinction between what is sound design and what is composition?
I'll start this because, oh, sorry.
I'm not a composer, so if I'm doing it, it's sound design.
I was just gonna start this one up because it's a big can of worms that's been in a can for many years, and I'm one of the people who's partly responsible for blurring the lines there. So just to kind of summarize it, yes, composition and sound design should be considered different things. Contractually, they rarely are, though, except for some of the big festivals like Stratford and Shaw. So I was engaged this season as both to do the sound design and the composition for Hamlet. And there's a lot of rules involved. So if you're on a sound design contract, you're not allowed to compose anything original if you're not on the composing contract. And it's outside of those institutions. I mean, it sort of works there, but the reason why we don't try to draw too hard a line between them in most cases is because it's just going to kind of work against us, I think. There's usually, most of the time when I do a sound design, I'm also composing thematic music for small productions. And it would be nice to be paid for both of those jobs. But if we were to be too strict about separating it, my fear is that they'll be contracting us only to sound design. And then we'd have to kind of like dig up public domain stuff or what, I kind of like that it's not, that there is a lot of blurring there, because in my own process, it's not always so clear. I've always used sound effects in my music, and I've always treated my sound designs as a kind of musical composition. So there is a lot of overlap. I think we should all be paid better once we're back doing it again. But yeah, I that's why I haven't been pushing for recognition of like composition versus sound design so much.
Yeah, it's a good question. I love the stuff that splits the line between sound and music too, that where you do stuff that it could be music or could be sound, depending on how you just to want to call it, because it's all really the same thing a lot of ways. The only area that I'm still curious about is just that rights thing, is that when you get somebody who's a sound designer, then quite often sometimes they ask you to use found music, whereas they don't ask that of composers very much. And then it's like, well, if you're going to use that found music, then you really have to get the rights for it, which nobody ever does. And then it becomes, well, you can get a sound designer who's cheaper, and you can use this found music and not pay for the rights, and that's cheaper. But it doesn't even really happen very much anyways, because it's really typically the same fee at just about any place for sound design and composition, as opposed to one or the other discipline.
Yeah, I think basically, artistically speaking, it's a continuum, right? And there's, on the one far end, there's just dedicated just sound design, and on the far other end, there's just composition. Most people exist somewhere in the middle along this continuum, and depends on the project. But from a producer's point of view and from credits point of view, I like to still think about the separation, or at least voice it, even if it's not enforced contractually. And it's about a couple of things. It's about, if you are not clear about that distinction, often there's not an awareness or understanding of what it takes to write a 5-minute orchestral piece for a full orchestra versus a quartet, versus just a piece, for a solo guitar versus just electronic. And there is no awareness based on what the requirements are of how much time and effort and also other support you might need to accomplish any of those tasks. And so depending on the project, I find that at least voicing it with the producer point of view just makes clear what the expectations are, what is being asked of you, and what you're able to deliver given the resources. And then if it's a really massive project, then it may be actually something where you need two jobs, where you do need a sound designer, you collaborate and work together. And it should be a two-person job and two people getting paid fairly, rather than just one person trying to put two hats, not because technically they can't, but because resources are not there to actually do it.
I would say that the distinction gets stickier when it comes to sound reinforcement. So with content creation, there's there can be a blurred line between music and sound, and certainly if you're doing a hybrid of something more contemporary and using found sound and so on. But the issue is, let's say you have musical theater, which is very distinct. You have a sound designer, and the composition is already created and given with the rights to the book. But lately, especially in Canadian theater, I found there's a push towards plays with music or plays with songs. And sometimes these come with existing music written by the original composer who premiered the show, and other times it falls on the sound designer to write new music. Or alternatively, if a play is produced in a venue like the CAA Theater, which is a large venue, you will most often have, almost always, I believe, have your performers in radio mics. So I've done shows where it's a play with original music, with instrumental backing tracks, with the singers that I've written, 300 sound cues, and everyone is also in radio mics. And by that point, Tech Week becomes a bit of a challenge when you are trying to split your brain into multiple disciplines, because do you listen to the mix? Are you tweaking compositional elements at that point? Are you running on stage and working out a balance or a monitoring perspective with the actors on stage? Or are you sitting in the house and listening to the overall mix? Are you listening to the vocal clarity? Are you listening to delay and EQ issues? So at that point, then I would agree with David that splitting those jobs becomes almost a necessity, because you can't have one person with two brains at the same time. Or you could, but they might lose their mind at some point during Tech Week. So,
or they need more time.
Or exactly. Or it's, does the composition get hammered out in a workshop prior to the production rehearsal period, so that at least you have one thing locked down before moving on to the next stage of it. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways to do it. And I think as having the conversation as early as possible and looping in the composer or the sound designer or the same person if they are wearing multiple hats, because one becomes one of the most essential ways to avoid any snags down the road.
I do stress always, like when you are doing it, to make sure you have a separate music credit when you are writing music, even if you're not getting a separate fee or whatever, just to make sure that you're making clear what those different roles and tasks are. So I consider that very important, and I've had to really really chase after producers to get that information properly credited.
I want to jump back slightly to something that JS touched on earlier, which I think is a great question, which is, how do you view the relationship between sound designer and audio technician? How should that look, feel in an ideal world?
I'm really lucky. I'm married to my audio tech, so it should be like a really perfect marriage, ideally. But like for reals, actually though, if possible, like a lot of open communication is good. In a lot of my relationships with collaborators and friends and colleagues, it's like I'm trying to just like develop inside jokes as early as possible, and I think that like kind of helps smooth things over. But actually it's about rapport and morale. Yeah, there seems to be this like interesting like sound flex that happens a lot, and calling it or not participating in it sometimes helps with the relationship between the asker, which in the sound designer case would be the asker, and then the person who's being asked.
I think ideally you want a relationship that is open and curious and friendly. And, I don't have a lot of technical knowledge, so I depend on my operator to know the space and to help me make my design better. And I would say like 7 times out of 10, I've gotten that. I've worked with people who I just have this. I guess I have an attitude walking into a space that I'm walking into someone's home, and I try to communicate that I understand that, and you know, like I said, 7 times out of 10, you have an operator who's engaged and who wants to help you accomplish what you want to what you want to do. Um, that's the ideal. It doesn't always happen. And I imagine it happens less for me than it would for, say, a female sound designer or somebody who may not fit the mold of what a sound designer is, whatever the hell that means. But yeah, that curiosity and that friendliness, I hope that I'm met with that, because that's what I try to offer when I walk into a space.
I think it can get quite complicated and political in some ways, but I'm gonna leave that side of it for a bit and focus on, from a purely relationship standpoint. I have done both, and for a few of the members here, I have been their sound technician or their house technician on shows, and I sort of see it from both points of view. Of a technician, I think the majority of sound technicians are trying to be helpful and are wanting you to help you deliver the best show you can. And I think designers often coming into the space by that point are under a huge amount of stress. They're at the end of a very long process. And then it really depends. Like you have to set up both sides of it. If I'm coming in as a designer, if I'm the sound technician, hopefully what you're trying to set right off the bat is trust. If you can get the trust of the person in front of you that A, you are competent, B, that you are vigilant. Actually, A is that you're respectful, B, that you're competent, C, that you're vigilant, and that you're going to be trying to work with the other person to get the best sound that you can. If that is established and if both sides are trusting those three things about each other, then I think it works beautifully well. And when whatever internal or external factors compromise any of those three sort of basic principles, that's when you start having misunderstandings or challenges.
I think that's like very brilliantly said. I also think like a part of it too is not carrying like past transgressions, even with like the particular person that you are then dealing with again later, into the room. Like that's because, tech week is hectic, and like whether you're just a house tech and you're just like trying to come into the super stressful experience, or if you've been on the show for like 5 weeks and you're trying to put it up again, like it doesn't matter. Like trying to rehash the past is not great. And I think walking into the room every day as like kind of blank slate and carrying this like energy or value of trust and respect is kind of just like what we should all do as human beings anywhere, right?
I often tell my students that anybody can put the sound of a door in a speaker. Ultimately, what will, and somebody gave me this advice when I first moved to Toronto. Ultimately, what people will want to work with is you, not your ability to put the sound of a door in a speaker. So if you know who you are and you can be respectful and you can be a human being, then that is the thing that will build your life and your career as well.
I found that working with a front of house mixer especially is in some ways similar to the relationship between a director and an actor, because you might have a vision, an overall arcing big picture of what the sound and the mix and everything will sound like when it comes together, but they are the ones performing it every night, and they will have whatever they walk in that day through the door. when they come into the space. And so if I'm working with them and giving notes during tech, for instance, I also want to hear from them, what issues might they have at the console with how things are laid out? Is it they actually can't hear something very well? Can we alter X, Y, Z so that they are better set up for success? Is it the way that I'm giving a note that they're not really understanding where I'm coming from, so that they can actually, it's not that I'm telling them I want it done exactly this way. It's what's the most authentic way for them to be able to replicate it every night in a way that makes sense to them, because they're the ones who are going through the motions of it. It's not me. It's I can mix a certain way that's comfortable for me, but ultimately they're the ones carrying the show. And if they can find their own personal way to tap into that, then I find it's and giving them agency wherever is best in terms of how they write their mix book, um, how they like to label things. Just even minute things like that, I find gives people a much more synergistic and symbiotic relationship with a designer that also then carries forward later on in the process.
What personally I'm trying to do is to, even though I'm maybe as nervous as the operator, is trying to just go forward in time. And I'll try to explain what I mean. Is that I've operated many of the shows I've designed on tour, but when you start a run, particularly on a show that is constantly changing, you're so worried about, are my wireless mics are going to drop there because he's behind that piece of thing, and then, oh my god, what's the next year? I can't remember what exactly. So but after a while you get comfortable, and then you start watching the show, hopefully not too much because you forget cues, but you get into it, and then you realize, oh, that fade could be a little bit more with that light effect that could really gel well. Then you stop doing your thing and you start doing a good thing for the show. And what I'm trying to do is, when I have an operator with me, is that they're stuck in that world, thinking of, the meters going and the battery that is going down. I'm going to have to replace that before that. And I'm trying to look at the show and just feed them little things so it's just to save them 2 months of of observations. So they, so just, did you see that? It's like, if we could do that at the same time as this thing rolls on the set, that'd be nice. And that's, oh yeah, okay. They would have figured it out by themselves, but it's just that you're not focusing on this. And if I see that they have a bit of mental space for that, I'm trying to push that. And then when it works, it's really cool.
It's a bit like directing, where you have to provide very, very clear direction to the person, but also be receptive to what they can, because they'll know little details about the space or about their equipment or something, and that can really make something work a lot better. When you've given them, like, this is what's supposed to happen, and they find a new way to do it, and that's how it works best.
True.
I think that is huge also from an interpersonal sort of standpoint, because when you do that, you're actually making them part of your team, even though you have met them at the very end of your rehearsal process. But they suddenly feel like a team member rather than just a minion that you're constantly telling them, go do this and bring that and mute that and change the battery and that. They will still do those tasks because that's their job. And most people take pride in doing that and doing it well. But it's always nicer to feel part of a team and to feel appreciated as a member of the team that's contributing.
I find there's a big difference between asking someone to do something and telling someone to do something, and you get a much better response from the former. It's like, here's a list of things I need you to do when you have the time to do it. And if you could get to like these 6 things first, because they're the priority, and just building those relationships of respect and being aware of their job as much as your job. And in turn, they're often willing to do more things for you. Like if you need them to underhang a speaker from a catwalk and they have to dangle over, they might be more willing to do it than if you were bossing them around all day. You know.
Totally.
I also like to leave things open in designs instead of programming certain fades and stuff. Just I tell them it's just you'll find the rhythm to fade that out. But I also accept that the first 2, 3, or 5 runs, it could be a little bit. But it's like playing a song. You know, when you get into it, your interpretation gets better. So, but I accept that. I accept that instead of writing that perfect 27-second really weird curve fade out, and say, well, you'll fade it out, and then you'll feel it. But then, of course, at the first run, it's like, ugh. But it's gonna work. Just trust them too. They're not idiots. They've been doing that for a long time, oftentimes, and they're really good. So,
And I think when you can establish that, and when the trust has been built that you are allowing them to do that, or if I'm a technician, I'm allowed to do that, it's huge, because we're ultimately doing a live art form, and you can write your cue. And what I was saying earlier about the actor's entrance and exit, if the actor changes the emphasis ever so slightly on the word or whatever, you might need to have the sensibility to wait that half extra beat, or come in half extra beat sooner, or do the fade a little bit. And if you allow for that and you can build that in, then it's just for the better of the show. And like you said, I think if you build it in and you have that rapport, most of them would do a great job. And then they're also not playing on their phone while they're running the show. They're actually running the show and engaged with it.
Amazing. Well, we're pretty much out of time here. There's a bunch of questions we didn't get to, unfortunately, but there's one final question that I want to end on, which is, has the pandemic led to any surprising or unexpected opportunities to use your sound design skills in new ways?
my wife's Zoom never sounded so good. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I never thought I would get nearly as good at repairing phone recordings.
There's a lot of cheap plugins right now. You can get great deals on plugins. I have a show coming up on Monday with the NAC. They're streaming one of the plays that got canceled this season. They're doing a reading for the NAC, and they asked me to do a little bit of the sound design that I was originally going to do for the show. So that'll be fun, and get to run QLab through Zoom for the first time. Hopefully it works.
It does work. I just did a Nightwood Theater. They canceled their show right before we started to tech, and they ended up doing a kind of adaptation of it for a live stream. And there were certain things that weren't going to work, so we stripped out some things from the design, but then other things, we kept in there, underscoring and stuff. So that did give me a little experience in kind of designing for live stream theater. And I think if I were doing it that way from the start, I might do some things a little differently.
This week I am starting studio experiments for my social distance concert in kind of low-key trespassing different public spaces very late at night, and singing and miking and listening.
I'm doing a lot of nothing and sitting and doing nothing and listening and staring at the wall and sleeping and doing a lot of things that I realize I have very little time for when I'm normally busy and working. And it's been occasionally strange, and other times comforting, and other times radically disturbing. And I don't know, we'll see what comes out of me when this is all over and what kind of weird designs I come up with. But certainly a shift in perspective, I think, more than anything. This, I would imagine, is the same with a lot of people right now.
All right. Well, that was one of the most thoughtful discussions we've had in the last 3 weeks. So thank you all so very much for joining us on the Title Block Live. some people were inquiring about how to engage with the artists we've had on and their work a little bit more. What I'll do is if any of you have online portfolios, SoundCloud, any video perform, but like tape form, anything like that you want to share, I'll put it in the show notes for the podcast feed, and I'll also pop it into the comments on the YouTube channel, and then people can engage with your work a bit more after we're done. In the meantime, I want to thank you all for being on the show, and remind everybody to go to thetitleBlock.com to see to engage with past episodes we've had. And again, I want to reiterate how, I mean, it's great that I've interviewed Richard Feren and we had a great conversation. So go to episode 41 and listen to that. But I'm sad that I haven't talked to any else of you. We need to have a more robust conversation about your careers and your philosophy
these days.
If only we had time.
I know it's the hardest thing to pin people down right now. They're just wandering in. They're in the kitchen, one iPhone, and I'm ringing in the
app.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really hard. So we have now. Unfortunately, I have. I'm in school right now, and our final giant big licensing exam got postponed. We had no idea when it was going to be. We thought, oh, it'll be the fall. Everyone's been trying to relax while they're inside. We just got news that it's actually happening in June. So I will have to study for that at some point, or continue studying for that. So we'll see how that goes. But I want to talk to all of you in the next little while, and that'll be on at thetitleBlock.com for sure. So
Can I just squeeze in one little plug here?
Yeah, please. Yes. Yeah.
Just remembered the next issue of Canadian Theatre Review will feature an in-depth feature on the dramaturgy of sound in theater, and they interviewed Deanna and I about it, and it's actually quite informative. So that'll be in the print, and I guess it'll be online as well. I'm not sure. Canadian Theatre Review.
Cool.
That's fantastic. Does anybody else have anything else they want to plug before we end?
The show I'm working on is called 5 Moments. I guess I should say that. So it's 8 o'clock Eastern time on Monday, the 4th.
I'll play us out with some theremin here as we go.
Yes, please do. Thank you so much, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me.